en Google, en varias áreas del negocio. Yo tuve el placer de trabajar con Anthony en el equipo de Android entre 2010 a 2012, cuando estuvimos juntos lanzando Google Play, que es la tienda de aplicaciones hoy en Google. Así que les doy la bienvenida. Como decíamos en la invitación, este webinar va a ser hecho en inglés porque Anthony lamentablemente no habla lo suficientemente bien español, pero lo haremos en inglés. Iremos un poquito más despacito para estar seguro que todo el mundo lo pueda entender, y también vamos a dejar un poco de tiempo al final de nuestra conversación para preguntas del público, y obviamente las preguntas las pueden hacer en español si quieren, y les haré a Anthony en inglés. Así que esto es bienvenidos a todos. Welcome, Anthony, to this edition of Leap Talks. We're really glad you could make it, and it's good to welcome you on our show today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Anthony, look, it's been a long time, obviously, since we talked. I think, for the benefit of the audience today, we're going to be talking about leadership. And whenever people talk about Google, they talk a lot, of course, about the technology and all the amazing products that you guys have built. But people also talk quite a lot about the culture of the company, right? And the ability to develop talent, and more importantly than just develop talent, I think they talk a lot about Google's ability to retain and nurture that talent over time, right? Which is incredibly challenging. And in Chile, I think one of the things that we've seen is we've seen a boom in activity related to technology for the past couple of years. A lot of new startups raising capital, a lot of people hiring or recruiting people very quickly. The market for talent has probably never been more competitive today. Has never been more competitive than it is today, to be honest. It's a really challenging market. So I wanted to kind of, start off by asking you a couple of questions. I mean, first, just starting with your background. You've been at Google 16 years, seen a lot, done a lot. When did you first start leading and managing teams at Google? And what was that like initially?
At Google or before Google?
Well, I mean, even before Google, it'd be great to know if you're. I didn't know if you were managing teams before Google, so we can start before Google as well.
Yeah. So I actually look older. I'm actually older than I look. So I actually, I work at a large company before Google, like GE, Hewlett Packard, Sun Microsystems. I also worked at a couple of startups. And I got my management opportunity at one of the startup, I think in my mid-20s, many decades ago. And I did not want to become a manager. As an engineer, I'm very introverted. I'm a little bit shy. I don't like standing in front of people and audience and talk, because I do get nervous and I just don't want to focus on me. So because of that, those reasons, I did not like to be a manager. But I had this CIO who kind of actually, force might be too strong of a word, but asked me to say, hey, the company is scaling. You are technically really strong. People respect you. You should become a manager. And I delayed that decision for months until the manager, my CIO, actually kind of forced me to make a decision, say, look, either you become a manager or I need to hire someone between you and me, because the company was growing. So it was more like I have to make that decision. And I did not want a layer between me and my CIO. So I took on that challenge of being a manager.
Yeah.
So that's
a really interesting point. That's a really interesting point that you're making, because oftentimes people don't really want to become managers, right? You get pushed into it, or your kind of career takes you in a certain direction, and it's like you're this great individual contributor doing wonderful things on your own, in your case, writing code, and then all of a sudden you're thrust into this situation where you have to lead and be responsible for others.
Yeah.
What were your first challenges there? What was, when you made that transition to manager, what were the biggest problems that you found? What were the most difficult things about becoming a manager?
Oh my gosh. There's a lot of things I learned. So first of all, my first year being a manager, like being an individual contributor as a software engineer, leading a technical project to now become a people manager, it's actually a huge shift. It took me about a year to really transition fully from
Right.
an individual contributor mindset to an engineering manager. I think the challenge that I had at that time was really learning to let go.
Yeah.
So before
Yeah.
I built, as a software engineer, I write the code, I build the product, I have the technical vision of how I want my product to go or what features need
Right.
to go. And
Hmm.
now I have to rely on the team to do those decision making for me. And letting
Yeah.
go is no longer my idea. It's just nurturing the team. And I think that's the hardest lesson I learned in my first year of being a manager.
That's interesting because at Leap we work with a lot of startups and we work with a lot of founders, and in Chile, there's a lot of very good founders. There's a lot of technically very savvy founders, good business people. But actually, oftentimes what we hear is this, and what we see is the same challenge as what you just mentioned, right? It's what we say in Spanish, it's aprender a delegar. It's learning how to empower and learning how to let go. Were there any particular tricks or tips that you learned that helped you start to let go and delegate to others?
Uh, well, there's this. I think I learned about the tips and tricks later on, but during that moment, I got a lot of feedback, and my manager delivered the feedback to me, saying that the team was not happy that I am still very hands-on and not giving them the opportunity to do those work, or I'm the one that's making the decision and not enabling them to make the decision. So they, the engineers, the team that reporting up to me feel like they're just executing my idea instead
Right.
of that their ideas matter and moving forward. So those were the feedback that was given to me, and then I learned to adapt to those because
Yeah.
at that moment I feel like, hey, I'm an engineering manager. I'm still being viewed as a tech lead. I'm the one that built the product, so it is. I'm the one that owns the problem if things don't go well, right? And I think if I were to give advice to potentially new managers coming in, my advice
Yeah.
for them is to really understand what their role is in a team. And the best way to do that is to just have an open discussion with their group to see what their expectations are.
Yeah. Yeah. I think having one of the things that I thought was very cool was that I remember that in 2012, I believe, Google ran this big project called Project Aristotle,
Yep.
if I remember correctly, right? And I was still there, and I remember that one of the research results was that high performance teams, one of the ingredients that makes them high performance teams was psychological safety. Talk to us a little bit about that. How do you create psychological safety as a leader?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very good question, and not an easy thing just to explain it, but I'll share my experience so that people, the audience, can understand. So psychological safety is basically a manager and the team, it feels safe enough to be able to communicate and express how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
So I used to be an individual contributor and I report to a manager. And I do in my career, I have a lot of bad managers. I have more bad managers than great managers. I do have okay managers here and there, but to find a great manager is very few and far in between. But I have more bad managers, and because of those experience, it's very hard for me to be open and honest about how I feel to the manager because there's that lack of trust.
Right.
So I can just go in and tell my manager how I feel because I feel that my manager controls my happiness. They control my career, they
Right.
control how much I earn, and they can control
Right.
my opportunity. So because
Okay.
of that, being a manager, I totally understand how my team feels if I exert a certain persona. And that, in a way, by doing that, diminish the psychological safety. So again, I think one of the things that a manager or a leader can do to build that psychological safety and trust is to invite people in to get to know them, meaning that the managers or the leaders need to be a little bit vulnerable. They need to be a little bit more personal. They do need to say, hey, I am just a human being, and I don't know this area, and I'm hiring you to come in and take care of this area that I might not know about.
Right.
Most leaders and managers, like Google, when they come in, somehow people feel that they are expected to know everything. So because of that, the managers tend to own everything and try to control everything. And the result of that is that they push people away, because a lot of people now say, why am I here? I don't understand why my manager is doing all this stuff when I am the expert in this area.
Right. So it's kind of a combination of, it sounds like what you're saying is that part of the challenge as a leader is empowering people, right? Letting go, as you were saying. And the other big challenge is building that psychological safety, building that trust, which you do by being vulnerable.
Yep.
Can you give us an example? It doesn't have to be real. Can you give us an example? How do you do that as a leader? How do you become vulnerable with your team so that they feel like they can approach you on difficult subjects?
Yeah. So, my impression early in my career is that when I look at my manager, I just feel like my manager is stoic, meaning they're very strong. Nothing can shake them or make them afraid.
Right.
They're fearless. So to be vulnerable is basically opening up to saying, hey, I don't know this.
Right.
That means that there's this area I don't know. So that's why, because a lot of employees view that the reason this person is a manager or a director or a VP is because they know everything.
Right.
But that's far from the truth. Like, I don't know a lot of things. And that's one of the reasons why I hire people to go in and do certain things, because I'm not good at those things. So to be vulnerable is to open it up. But the best way to do this is whenever something goes well or go wrong, you do a retrospective. For the audience, a retrospective is, once a period of time, you go back and you reflect on what went well and things that could be better. And what can you do about it? And I think the manager can be vulnerable by saying, hey, I did this. I don't know if I did it correctly or not. What do you all think? And then that's when they gather the feedback and just have an open discussion and don't take the criticism personally. It's more like, here are the things that we can do better. And the manager could be part of that solution to say, okay, I could have communicated this better, or I could have made this decision faster, or I could have prioritized this and put this person in this leadership role to own this instead of me trying to do everything, for example. So that's what being vulnerable is.
Yeah, I think, you raise a very important point there, which I think is very overlooked, right? And we see this, I see this a lot in Latin American business culture, is you don't always see a lot of interest, like retrospection, like you said, right? It's like you launch a product and you totally miss your numbers. The sales are not what you expected them to be. Or you launch a new call center and it's understaffed and you're swamped with angry customers, right? And I think part of the challenge sometimes you see in Latin America is people spend a lot of time on strategic planning, but they don't necessarily spend a lot of time reviewing why things didn't go well, right? There's not enough emphasis on, let's try and find out where we made the mistakes and just have an open conversation to try and learn from that and not to make the mistake again, right? There tends to be, there tends to be the el miedo del castigo, what they say in Spanish, right? The fear of being punished. And so oftentimes people don't want to go back and revisit why things didn't work out because there's a fear of who's going to be shamed and blamed, right? Instead of, what we say at Leap is, no existe fracaso, solo aprendizaje. There's no such thing as failure. There's only learning, right? And that's one of the things I took away from my time at Google is there was a lot more emphasis, during the OKR process of going back and looking at, okay, if we got a 40% on this initiative, what do we learn from that, right? What do we take away from that? I think
I think
really important concept.
You touched something that I forgot to mention too about some of the lessons I learned at being a manager. So besides learning to let go, I think one of the things that a lot of leaders and managers don't do a lot is making decisions.
Yeah.
Right. There's this concept many times in America, which is managed through consensus, which means that before a manager or a leader make a decision, they get consensus. They get like 80% of the population agree on certain things because it is safe. When you have 80 people saying, hey, this is the path that you want to go, and it fails, then you're kind of basically saying, hey, I made this decision because 80% of the population agree with this. So when it fails, all of us fail, right? And like you're saying that the retrospective many times is that the leader or the manager can be shielded by making a safe decision. And I think this is not necessarily being a manager, but being a great leader means that sometimes you do need to make the hard decisions to really declare that this is the path that we go that might be against the most popular decision out there. And then when things goes wrong, this is what being vulnerable means, is that person have to go in and say, I made this decision based on this data or this information or this thing that I'm thinking in my head, and then take ownership and responsibilities if things doesn't go well, right?
Exactly, right. I think that's a very important point. I think that you touch on is, one of the things that we have seen, at Leap over the past few weeks, and I reached out to talk to a bunch of other startups and a number of other CEOs and heads of sales, and I asked them. I said, "What are you guys seeing in your business? Like, what's happening?" Because in Chile we just had the elections, right? So we just had the first round of elections on Sunday, and they have two runoff candidates, and now there's going to be the second round in December, and the country has been kind of really riveted by this election. It's been very polarizing because of the social challenges that happened back in 2019 when people took to the streets and there were large protests. And what you saw was a lot of business leaders not making decisions because they were afraid of, well, we don't know where the country's going to go, right? We don't know if this guy's going to win, if this other guy wins, does that mean all of a sudden taxes are going to go up? Does that mean there's going to be change in the pension system? Does that mean that they're going to expropriate properties? I mean, there was a lot of conversation and a lot of stress and fear, right? And one of the things that we saw, and I was talking with other CEOs and other people that we know at Leap and clients, and everybody was telling me the same thing. They're like, yeah, people are not making decisions because there's all this fear, right? And that's the challenges as leaders. Even when the environment is tough, even when it's very ambiguous, even when we don't know what the future holds, we still have to make decisions, right? Life goes on. We still have to make decisions, and sometimes very tough decisions, right? So I think making tough decisions, that's a critical part of what good leaders do. And I think you touch on a very important point there, which is making a tough decision oftentimes is tough because people disagree with it.
That's right. And the other thing also, because Google, a lot of people want to get promoted to the next level. And the higher you go up the corporate chain, right? So you might be a manager, senior manager, director, senior director, VP, senior VP, and then higher up than that, is that each level you go up, the decision doesn't get easier. It gets harder.
Exactly.
And a lot of people I like a nice title. I like the compensation that goes with that title, but to do all that stuff, you do need to make like the hardest decision out there, which tend not to be easy. Like there are times when I do need to make a decision in terms of, should I invest in this project or do I need to cancel it? And that's a hard decision because if I cancel it, then it affects the people that's working on that project. And it creates a lot of sleepless night for me because I am in a position where I might ruin people opportunity and
Yeah.
financial situation, right? Because they depend on this job. And I'm basically making the decision to shut down that project, for example. But then if I don't do that, then I'm burning money and there's no good return on that investment. So I have to figure out what is needed. And the higher you go up and you own that, you are basically are the decision maker. And you have to make those decisions, and you cannot do consensus there.
No, you can't. No, I absolutely agree with you. And tell me one thing. I mean, what have you seen, either at Google or GE or some of the other companies where you worked? What have you seen companies do well to develop their leaders? What are good programs or initiatives that companies can do to improve leaders, particularly new leaders, particularly people who potentially haven't been leaders before? What should companies be doing?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there in that what are the companies doing to build great leaders, not what are companies doing to build great managers. There's a huge difference between the two. Personally, for me, I think that being a great leader does not necessarily mean that you need to be a great manager or need to be a manager. So that means as an individual contributor, I can be a leader. But I believe that in order to be a great manager, you do need to be a great leader. Because without being having great leadership skills, then I think you're just being an okay manager. So like you mentioned, Hewlett Packard, GE, even Sun Microsystem were big companies back in the late 90s and early 20s. And they have great management and leadership training. But when I went through that, it gives me the basis of what is needed as a leader or what is needed to be a good manager. But the difference that I see with Google's training is that it comes from within. What I mean by that is that the program was really catered towards how do we build great leaders, not in a generic form, but how do we build great leaders that makes Google more effective?
Right.
So it's from within, meaning that the training is really gathering feedback from leaders and managers and people in high position to saying, hey, we want this type of leaders at Google because if they have the skill set, they will be more effective. Right. So that's how we kind of bring great engineers in and also train them to be great leader within the concept of how good Google is, right? Whereas if you take like a GE training or a Hewlett Packard training, then that can be transferable between different companies. If you leave one company, you go to the next one, but it's generic. It's just the basic principle that you need to know. But I think what makes Google's training is much better is that they build individual contributor to be a certain leader. And that leadership is something that other company wants, because if you look at how well Google is being run and their stock appreciating, you're saying if that is success, then we want those people to join my company because they know something, they have that secret sauce, and we want to get those people to continue to build that for the company that you work for.
And what do you think it is? I mean, are there without disclosing things which are confidential, right? But are there specific things or are there specific abilities that Google focuses on in terms of developing leaders?
Yeah, so there's this analysis that Project Aristotle is based off, and you can Google this. Your audience can Google this. It's called Project Oxygen. There's a Harvard Business Review study on this. So Project Oxygen was made available back in 2008. There are 8 guiding principles. I don't know them on top of my head, but a leader is really someone who is have insight, like have a vision, inspire others to go and be motivated to get to go in towards this path. So that was that study. It's a multi-year study. It's a research. It was published in 2008, and there's a lot of studies around this. In 2016, Google went back and looked at the data and see, does high-performing managers do better than just okay managers? And they found out that, high-performing manager with these attributes actually retain their team much better. And it's not because the team got compensated more or they have faster promotion rate, even the people who didn't get promoted and they do the same job, they tend to stay with that manager because they think that manager is a great leader based on those attributes. So Google added in 2 more attributes. So that's a total of 10 now, in addition to the original Project Oxygen 8 attributes.
Okay. Are those are the full 10 publicly available online, or is it just
No, I believe so. I think if you search for it, at least the 8, I do know that it's on the Google search engine. You can Google it, and it should be there.
Interesting. And so, I mean, when you think about some of the key skills that Google may have helped you develop, are there any skills that really stand out above the others, which you felt like, Google's culture or Google's kind of like leadership development practices helped you develop?
Yeah. So I want to let your audience know, this is more coming from the technical side, because as a company, you have marketing, you have non-technical, right? Sales.
Of course, yeah.
But from a technical side, I think one of the things that we train the engineers is that, one, we know that most engineers we hire tend to be introverted.
Right.
Meaning that they're very good at computer science, they're very good at solving technical problems and challenges, but they might not want to socialize or collaborate too much. Not everyone's like this, I'm stereotyping, but there are certain traits that Google hired, and they Google leaders understand that. And they say, well, one of the things that we want to do at Google is to be collaborative. So most of the leadership training that we do is that we want engineers to be able to work with other engineers. And the best way to do that is to really look from within and do a self-assessment of who am I? What type of work, like what type of personality do I have when I come to work? When I show up to work, how am I showing up? Like, how do people view me when I work on a technical project? And we try to make sure that all of the people understand that there's no one right way of a type that works well, right? Because the tendency is that when you hire someone, you try to hire a mirror image of yourself.
Yeah.
And there's studies after studies after studies that diversity of opinion actually make the product much, much better than if you hire people with the same type of mindset. So Google really brought in to really think about, I'm different, you're different, let's appreciate our differences. And because of that, we understand what our differences is, and that we should come in and then collaborate that, so that when I speak and challenge you about your opinion, you understand that I'm not challenging you personally.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That don't take it personally, because I'm not saying that you're not good. I'm saying, hey, this idea, the way you look at it might not be what we want at this moment in time. So it's more like your approach to problem solving because of your work style more than of who you are. And I think that's the thing that I think Google does the training really well, because it keeps people to say, I appreciate your diversity. I appreciate your personality. You are a cool person, but for this project, this opinion might not fit right now. It could be better off a year from now, but right now we need to solve this problem.
So it's a very interesting comment, because I remember, when you and I launched Play, we had to build a lot of these teams from scratch, right?
Yeah.
I mean, some of these teams didn't exist, right? And I remember in marketing, they asked me to head up and build that team. And one of the things that I'll always remember very fondly from that experience, aside from the long hours, which I don't recall fondly, was that we built this incredible marketing team that was extremely diverse. I mean, we had people from all over the world. We had people from India, we had people from Korea. We had people from Italy. We had a guy from New York. We had all sorts of very diverse people who were ethnically very different. Who had different work experiences. We had people from Google. But then, we hired a guy who was at Goldman Sachs, to kind of do brand marketing, who had worked in banking, right? So we had this kind of weird, strange team that was really heterogeneous. And as a manager, was kind of a pain in the ass to manage sometimes, because people were so different.
Yep.
But the cool thing about that team was that the diversity of perspectives and experiences made for very rich problem solving, right? As you were mentioning, you get a lot of people bringing a lot of different ideas to solve a problem who may come with ideas that you completely wouldn't think about if you had 7 people who'd worked in marketing at Procter & Gamble, as an example, right?
Yep.
And so I think that was one of the things that I recall from the time at Google that I found was really unique about the culture at that time.
Yeah, and you hear this a lot in the press too, that Silicon Valley is in a bubble because we hire people that live in Silicon Valley solving Silicon Valley problem. But then it might not work over in South America because that's not the problem that maybe South American has, right? They just like in Silicon Valley. So forget about South America. It's the other part of the United States. It might not work for them. So by having diversity and saying, hey, for me as a user with this background and this needs, you might want to add in this feature because your feature might not be relevant for me and I'm not going to use this product if it's only solving 10% of the problem and I need it to solve like more than 50% of the problem. So diversity really, really matters. And I think that's one of the things that Google leadership program trained. The other one, of course, is communication, like how to effectively communicate with others through the differences. Because as I mentioned, most technical people tend to be more introverted than extroverted. And they don't know how to express what they really want, especially when Google hire really smart people, right? When you get hired at Google, you're like the best of the best early on. So because of that, you feel like my opinion matters and you're seeing this other person challenging your opinion. You're like, what the heck? Just like what you're saying that you hire someone from Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is not a small company. It's a really great company. And that person comes to Google might feel like, okay, I need to prove myself because I am really good at my job. So why is this person from Google who have no experience in challenging me? And how do we effectively influence each other for a common solution effectively? And I think that's the challenge that Google has early in its days. And the leadership training is really to effectively coach people and educate people to effectively communicate with, understanding the differences among each other.
So that's you raise another topic there, which is interesting. Which I remember at my time at Google, and unfortunately, I was so naive and so high on myself during those days that I did not take advantage of this opportunity. But if I remember correctly, and I don't know if it's still the case, but Google has like an internal coaching program, right, where they provide coaching to people who need it, based on certain basis. What can you tell us about that? Because it's kind of, when you talk about coaching, oftentimes in Latin America, you get one of several different responses. One is you get a defensive response where the executive says, I don't need coaching. There's nothing wrong with me. Very common. The other response that you might get was, I simply don't understand what coaching does. And I don't really understand what the value of it is. Right. And then finally, some people sometimes kind of they have fear because they think, oh my God, my manager wants me to get coaching. That means that, they're going to fire me or that I'm doing something horrifically wrong. So talk to us, if you can, talk to us a little bit about the role of internal coaching at Google and how that's worked. And if you have any experience with that, I'm curious.
Of course. So the coaching program that you mentioned at Google are for directors and above. Okay. And it's paid for by Google. It's an external coaching program that Google actually hire consultants to come in or a coach to come in. We are developing coach internally as well. So there are Googlers who are going through coaching certification. But you're right. I think coaching has a negative connotation because in the beginning, coaching was offered to people who struggle with, running an org and they need a coach to help them to fix something. But I think a lot of times people forget that having a person there as a second opinion to be a soundboard to pass ideas through is actually super helpful. And I think a lot of senior leaders, meaning directors and above, I see a lot of VP, like you mentioned, are now taking advantage of that program because they realize that, hey, I have somebody here that I can actually talk about certain things, and the coach will hold me accountable for this.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. I think a good coach will be somebody who listens to their coachee, the person who needs a coach, and then listen to them and then provide some ideas so that the coachee, the person who needs the coach, can make the decision, and the coach hold them accountable for that. Right. So I think a good coach listens more and talk less.
Right.
But Google has many programs. They also have a advising program, which I'm part of. So I started a tech advisor program back in 2009. And advising and coaching is somewhat different in that.
Sure. Yeah, it is.
Advice is like a situation, right? Like you come to me and say, hey, Anthony, I have this situation and I need your advice. Whereas a coach tend to be a little more long-term, which is, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? And the coach will try to tell this person that's needing the coach, is like, well, when are you going to make that decision? We've been talking about this for forever.
Right.
Right. So the coach will then handhold that person so that person make the decision. So we have that as well, where an advising, the advisor like me can go in and listen to a problem and we can give them some advice. But one of the things that we're doing with the tech advisor program is send the tech advisors to coaching training.
Right.
Because we realize that advising is not just advising, you also need to coach as well. So we have that. So it's just in the toolbox that either you give an advice or you help someone and coach them through a situation. And then Google also has this thing called Mentor on Call, which is home run by other Googlers, and a mentorship program, which now runs over quarters, if not yearly. And that person can find a mentor, a buddy, through their journey at Google to coach them and mentor them and advise them through their career at Google to saying, this is how Google works. So the coach is external, is meant for senior leaders. The tech advisor program is basically advisors who are directors and above, that anybody in the tech org can ask for advice to the senior leaders. And then the mentoring program is basically other Googlers who can just feel like, hey, I got a lot of help from people. I want to pay it forward by helping other Googlers who might be lost.
Yeah, those are great programs. Those are great programs. And I think you touched on something important, which is the difference between coaching and mentoring, right? Is, I've coached a fair number of leaders in Chile, and oftentimes people will come to you with a problem and they expect you to give them a solution, right? Which is basically mentoring. And what I found, and that's sometimes useful, especially when people are under time pressure, which in our day and age, everybody's always under time pressure. But I think, the thing that I remember when I had a bunch of problems in 2017 and I sought coaching, the thing that really helped me the most was the fact that the coach was asking me all these questions, and that got me thinking, and I came to my own conclusion, right? Nobody was telling me what I needed to do. They were asking me powerful, simple questions, which helped me figure out, what the options were. And then, of course, the coach was very good in saying, okay, Patrick, what are you going to do about that? And then you're like, shit, I need to make a decision. Right? So it's like, I need to make a decision. And then the coach is like, okay, what's the decision? And you're like, okay, the decision is I'm going to fire this person. Okay, when are you going to fire them? So, it's like, I think it goes back to this idea that you touched on earlier, which is so important for leaders, is that, good leaders hold themselves accountable. Right. And I think that's also why people look to leaders, and, they're the first to realize when a leader makes a decision that he doesn't follow through with it. And people don't always realize the implications of that. So having the coach there, in my case, for example, I'll never forget when I had this realization that I should become a coach. My coach was like, okay, great. You have this realization. So what? Now what? And I was like, well, I think I need to get certified. And he's like, okay. And when are you going to do that? Well, I'm going to have to do some research. Okay. When are you going to do the research? Right. And so it becomes a forcing function for you to actually hold yourself accountable and make tough decisions. And for me, it was a big decision because essentially I never kind of quit being, I started Leap and I continued to work with owners and all this stuff. But becoming a coach was a huge decision because it was essentially taking my career in a completely different direction. And all of a sudden, I was learning a whole bunch of skills to go back to school, right? So that was a major shift. But it's interesting how sometimes people realize that they need this help and they look for it proactively. We have a number of clients like that are great, some of which are on this call today, actually. And other times, people like me only get coaching when their life falls apart and everything blows up and there's a huge fire and they need to put it out, right?
Yeah, and it's funny. It's like we need a coach or we need an advisor when it's like too late, right? Like I need to make this decision. I need this advice because I'm in this situation there's a fire, that something is burning. But I think that's the thing. I think once you help that person navigate that issue, then you build up a relationship with that person. I think a lot of executives at Google are realizing now that I need to have a coach and a mentor or someone before it becomes a fire. Like I have this idea and I need a coach sooner than later, because by the time it comes to the point when I need someone, it's too late because I have to make a decision anyway. So that's something I think a lot of executives are now beginning to realize, that having a coach does not necessarily mean that I'm done something wrong and I need a coach. Is that I find a coach to be a partner of mine because I kind of know who I am. Let's say I'm a procrastinator. I don't make decisions, or it's hard for me to make a decision without gathering a lot of data or research. So the coach will be there to saying, you have enough research, you have enough data, you can make a decision, just make the decision, right? So having someone there early on through that journey really helps.
So that leads me to kind of my next question, and in a couple of minutes we're going to open up questions to the audience, because I'm sure we got a lot of people here who are dying to ask questions too. One of the things that people find sometimes when we coach people at Leap, one of the things that most surprises people is to know a side of themselves that they didn't see before, right? And so each one of our projects, whether we do it for a leader or whether we do it for a team, we always start off by doing a diagnostic. And the interesting thing is, and Eric Schmidt at Google once made this comment. He said, the interesting thing about coaching is that people are never as good as seeing themselves from the outside as other people see them, right? And that's where coaching can be very powerful. And so, how do you guys at Google go about identifying areas of improvement, or what kind of diagnostics do you guys use, that are kind of like more 360, so that leaders can get a better idea of what are the things I really need to work on to be a better and more effective leader?
Yeah, you're right. I think the biggest critic about ourselves is ourselves, right? Like the biggest critic for me is myself. I'm my biggest critic. I don't really say I do something well or good. Other people tells me that I am doing well or I'm good at certain things. So we do have an exercise called the 360 review. And for those that people don't know, 360 means that if in your professional career, normally you get feedback from your manager, right? That's basically one direction. You go in, you say, I did this job. Your manager gives you a manager assessment on what they think you've done. But Google also does peer assessment. So not only am I getting assessment from my manager, but I also get it for my peer. Like, for example, Patrick, when you and I in Google Play, you write a review for me, I write a review for you because we are peers in Google Play.
Yeah.
If you're a manager, you want your team members to write a review for you as well. Now, most managers might not be comfortable with that because as a manager, you give a review assessment of your direct reports, but here, the direct reports is giving a feedback about you being how well you are as a manager for them and the team, right? So 360 is just that, is you have your manager writing a review for you, you have peers writing review for you, And not just peers in the same organization, but peers outside of your organization, like your partner from another organization, and then your direct reports coming up to you. And it's really interesting because I've gone through that exercise 3 times in my 16 years at Google. And I can tell you each time I've done that assessment about myself, I have changed where I was, what I thought of myself, or what I think I did well from the first exercise to the third one. And then during that time, I have 3 different managers, different set of peers, different set of direct reports. And it's always interesting to see that this is what I think of myself, like this is my self-perception. And what my manager thinks of me are my strengths and weaknesses, what my teams thinks of me, my peers, and then my peers thinks of me. And it's sometimes hard to swallow. It's sometimes hard to see that this is my perception. This is my brand. This is what people perceive of what I did well and things that I need to improve. So we do have that.
It's true. I mean, I remember the worst feedback I ever got as a manager was my first year at Google. I did my 360 with the marketing team at Play, and I thought I was a good manager. I thought, I'm pretty good, right? I have this job at Google. I'm a director. I must be pretty smart, right? And I remember getting the feedback and sitting down with my HR VP, and they said, "You are a horrible listener." Horrible. And I'll admit, I have not gotten much better over the years, Anthony. I've really tried, but I still struggle. And my team said, you'll go into a meeting and you'll ask the same question like 3 times because your mind is in so many places that you're not paying attention. And it's interesting because, when as leaders, when we don't listen to people, we hear them, but we don't listen. Then when we have to go back and clarify or ask them the same question again, they feel disrespected, right? They feel unimportant. They feel like Patrick has asked me this question 5 times over the last week, and he's clearly not paying attention. Therefore, I must not be very important, or this topic is not very important. And I didn't realize how devastating that was on my team. It was really impacting my relationship with them, and it was really impacting the level of trust. And, I remember after that feedback, we put together an action plan, and there were 2 representatives from my team who I would meet with every Friday afternoon to review how I was doing. And I had a series of exercises and things, and I got a little bit better, but, I still kind of suck, to be honest, but I got a little bit better. But it was really a shock to me because I thought I was a much better leader than I was. And it wasn't until I went through that process where I realized, wow, I need to work on this and I need to work on this. And I did this for a CEO here in Chile a few years ago who was, really, really talented, Harvard MBA and everything. And I remember when I sat down and I showed this CEO the result of their 360, they were stunned. They couldn't, they had a hard time processing and accepting that there were things in that 360 from their team that they thought they were much, much better at. And it was a revelation, and it forced them to make a significant number of changes, which, today that CEO left their company. She started a startup. She has done amazing things, but it's a very tough process to go through. I think
it's a humbling experience.
It's very humbling. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is what I mean by being vulnerable, right? Because most leaders will take that feedback and say, I don't care about the feedback of my organization. But being vulnerable, like what you demonstrated, is that, oh my God, this is what my team is thinking of me, and then addressing those issues. So you're basically saying, hey, team, I care about you. I didn't realize this. I'm listening to you now. I'm going to do something about it, right? So for those in the audience, that's a good example of what being vulnerable means. It's accepting that feedback from people in your org. And, besides the 360, Google, I don't know if your audience know this, but Google does a performance review twice a year, every 6 months. And as a people manager, you also get a manager review. And you get a score for that. And what Google does is it asks those 8 project oxygen attributes. Right. I think they increased it to 10 now. and they ask your team to rank their manager between a scale of 1 and 5. How well is the manager in each of these attributes? And you get that score, and it goes into your performance review if you're a good manager or not. So the managers are getting constant feedback twice a year, every 6 months, on how well they are doing as a people manager.
That's great. I think that's essential.
Yeah, which is very interesting because, coming from Hewlett-Packard, coming from GE, coming from Sun, is always one way, which is I never get feedback from my direct report. I only get feedback from my managers. And it's good and bad. If your manager likes you, then you got it made. But if your manager doesn't like you, but your team likes you, then you're kind of like screwed because you only get feedback from your manager. You don't get it from your team.
Absolutely. Hey, listen, I realize we have 9 minutes left, and so I wanted to open up the last 9 minutes that we have to the audience because I know that we have a number of people here who would love to ask you some questions. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. Para todos los que quieren hacer preguntas ahora a Anthony, si tienen una pregunta que quieren hacer, la pueden poner aquí en el chat, en español o en inglés, como quieran. Yo le puedo hacer la pregunta y luego traducírselo. Así que cualquier pregunta es bienvenida. Si quieren hacerla. Any questions are well, relatively speaking, any questions are fair game. So if people have questions, I'm trying to scroll up because I know that there was one question which was asked by Franco. Let me see if I can find it. All right, let's see. Yeah, so Franco here, who I believe is from Argentina, had a question where he said, how can I empower my team of developers so that they can better empathize and communicate more effectively? That's his question. So he's running a dev team. How can he improve empathy and get them to communicate more effectively? What would you recommend there?
Wow, that's tough. It's actually that one question touches 3 things. The first one is you do need to create an environment where people feel empowered. So as a manager, how do you create an inclusive team environment that you show concern for the well-being of the team, especially in this pandemic, right? And not only the well-being of the team, but also success of them, not just the project. So if they are going to go and do this in this particular environment, how are you going to treat them with care, understanding the situation, showing the concern of them, the project, and then also really think about the success of the project and how to reward them and recognize them with the understanding of where things are. So that's one. I think the other thing also is, in order to get to that point, is that you do need to have a clear vision and strategy for the team. And this is something that, Pat, you talk about OKRs. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, OKRs stands for objective and key results. As a leader, besides being a manager, as a leader, you do need to have a vision of where you want to take your organization, or if you own a company, your company, or the product, if you're working on a product, like within a period of time. Normally, Google has an annual OKR as well as a quarterly OKR. So once every 3 months, as well as once a year. So if you have a year-long vision, you break it down per quarter. And then the last one, of course, is what we talk about, is being an effective listener. Right. So in order to be a good communicator, you do need to be a good listener. And once you listen to them, you need to share the information to the team. So it's all of those things. It's actually not hard. It's not easy. It's a very hard skills to develop. But as a manager, you can start developing yourself to be a good listener. And you were talking about an example about, you come in and you don't listen. I think a lot of people, we listen. But I think the thing here is sometimes we listen to win. Right. Meaning that you only listen what you want to hear. Exactly. So, and then you put in an argument where you want to win that argument, even though the person is raising an issue. Right. So you're listening.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that's a very good point, Anthony, because people, like, one of the things that we were taught in coaching, which, frankly, is now something that we teach all leaders, is simply to summarize what the person is telling you, right? So if I understood you correctly, people are often listening to win instead of listening to actually solve the problem together, right? Right there, what I have just done is I have summarized what you just said, and I'm acknowledging that I understood you correctly. I'm also giving you an opportunity to correct what I just said.
Yep.
Right? Most people don't do this. This is a big part of the problem is most people, they listen, it goes in one ear, and then it comes right out the other. And then they go back to the argument that they've been thinking about in their head to win the argument.
That's right.
Instead of actually saying, here's what I heard. Did I understand this correctly? And, then you can even take it a step further. You can say, I'm also sensing that you might be feeling this, or the other about this topic, right? Which takes you a big step forward in terms of building confidence and empathy. But I think that's spot on. I think the listening piece, people forget that great communication is also about listening.
Right, and sharing information, right? Like you do need to share information too, because that's what being an inclusive and psychological safety is. I think if you remember early on in Google's career before Google went IPO, there was criticism that Larry and Sergey was sharing financial information to
I remember that.
Googlers, right? And then I remember Eric Schmidt mentioned this, and then Eric said, you can't do this because we're about to go IPO and you have to quiet down. But Larry and Sergey didn't care because they say, if we want people to contribute, they need to understand the information of how their work impact the overall big picture, right? Exactly. So there's that trust. Like I'm sharing this data, it's sensitive information, but I feel like you need to know this information to do your job well.
Exactly. So another question that we have is from Pablo, and Pablo says, how was your experience managing your future replacement as a manager? I don't know I guess you've had some experiences where you've had to figure out, who your replacement was going to be and kind of manage that transition. What did that look like?
Yeah. So early in my career, I don't think of managing myself out of a job. That was not my my understanding. Like I feel like if someone comes in, I feel job security, right? It's like a defensive mode. It's like, why is this person in? And I ramp that person up. So I keep everything to myself and not share anything. Right. But I learned after a couple of years that if I don't share, then I cannot let go. And if I can't let go, I can't do new things.
Right.
So now I'm constantly, always, whenever I go and start a project, I'm thinking, how do I manage myself out of a job? And the thing I realized is that managing yourself out of a job takes time. It takes years sometimes.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, I've been with Google for 16 plus years, and I'm not in one team. I was in Android, Google Play, I'm in cloud, I was in infrastructure. The only way for me to have this mobility within a career at Google for 16 plus years is for me to let go. Like I mentioned, learning to let go is one of the hardest things I think any leaders can do. But in order for me to let go, I have to backfill myself. And that takes some time.
Yeah.
Especially as a director.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to make yourself, it's really tough to accept this, but you have to make yourself dispensable.
Yeah.
Right. Which human nature is the opposite, is we fear for our own safety, for our job, our well-being, our income. So the boss always feels like they need to be needed. Right.
Yeah.
Claudia Diaz has another question where she says, in Latin culture, it's not normal for people to give feedback to the boss or the leader. How do you create a trustworthy environment in order to receive honest feedback? I guess, how do you create a trustworthy environment to receive honest feedback as a leader? And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about vulnerability, right?
Yeah. So Google has a APAC region, right? So like in China, Singapore, Japan, Korea, South Korea. And the Asian culture is similar to that too. They don't want to criticize. They don't want to speak up and challenge the leader or the manager because there's a fear of reprimand. So when I go to the APAC region of Google and do leadership training, the thing I always tell the leaders is that you need to go and bring your team together and just have like a couple of day session of team building. So to build trust, you do need to do team building. And there's a lot of exercise about team building, which is getting to know each other. And the thing that the manager or the leader needs to do is that they need to make sure that they are part of the team building exercise. That means they're just becoming an individual contributor and not be perceived within the people of that training to be a leader or a manager. Because by doing that, then you are no longer an equal. You need to
Right.
make sure that you're an equal, because one of the things that's going to come out of that is again, being humble, receiving the criticism, is that you hear a lot of people, and then people feel safe, that they feel like, oh, my manager is just an individual contributor in this exercise. They're just a peer. They're no longer my manager. I feel safe to go in and speak my opinion. But it's
Right.
not just a once and done. It's really developing that relationship with your organization. And you do need to care. You have to take an interest in the individual reporting up to you, because
Right.
people know, just like kids, right? Like, you know if your parents love you or not because of like what they do to you or ignore you, or like, I think people are very smart if the manager cares about them or not. So I think it's a relationship that you have to build, and that takes time. It's not a one situation and one training, you're done. You have to develop that over time, because trust is built over time, but then mistrust is just an instant.
Exactly.
It takes a
That's
moment.
the problem, right?
Yeah.
That's the biggest problem, is it takes years to build trust, and it takes seconds to break it, right? It's one of the torturous things. I mean, my last question, which again came from Pablo, is, how do we go about developing new leaders in our team, right? I mean, are there tricks and tips and advice that you can give people on, say I have a good team, I have that trust, either I'm grooming somebody to become a leader to take over from me, or I'm grooming somebody to be a leader, to lead another team. Any practical advice or suggestions on what can we do to develop the next generation of leaders, particularly in this kind of crazy hybrid post-COVID Zoom, not Zoom world that we live in?
Yeah, I think any kind of leadership training in the post-pandemic world is going to be a hybrid of on-site and online training. On-site training or in-person training is always better because you get to interact. I think one of the things I realized is that even though if you're an introvert, you do need human interaction.
Yeah.
So as an engineer, I'm still very much introverted, but the thing that I know is that I do need to collaborate and talk to other people to get great ideas. So with that being said, I think, first of all, to really build the next leader, you need to understand what your needs are for your company or the company that you work for. Just like I mentioned early on, that I think GE, Hewlett Packard have great leadership training or great management training, but it's very generic. It's basically you can hire a consultant outside to give you all of this psychology training, and then they send everybody with this different background to the same training, and it doesn't work that way. Especially engineers who are driven by data, right? So anything that is not data driven, the engineer is going to say, I don't believe that. That's just somebody's opinion and it's not really factual. Right. So Google did this by saying, okay, we have this group of engineers that are going to be this, they're going to become the next set of leaders because they're going to be at this level. And at this level, like a senior software engineer, they need to be good leader. They're going to get to that level because they have great leadership skills, because at that level, we require them to be a leader. So we go in and we do a lot of training on the individual to understand who they are. I think a lot of times we don't invest in ourselves. We don't really understand who we are, what makes us tick, what we think we're good at, what other people think that we're good at, and how do we articulate that we might not be good at that and we might be good at this. I'll give you a very simple story here. Most engineers tend to be action-oriented, right? But then there's a lot of engineers who don't like that. So if I'm a manager and I need somebody to quickly prototype something because I don't know if the market likes it or not, then I want somebody who is not afraid of taking risk and fail. Right. There are a lot of engineers who don't want to work on risky projects because they don't want to fail. And they'd rather be behind the scene and just really analyze things and making things perfect. So if you take that person who is averse to failure and put them on a prototyping project, then nothing's going to get done because the engineers themselves won't be the right fit for that project. And in order to do that, as a manager, as a leader, you do need to understand who is good at what, right? Like kind of like a chess piece, right? A pawn is good for this, a bishop is good for that, a rook is good for that. So you need to make sure that you understand the diversity of your team, what their styles are, and then they need to assess that because they need to communicate that to you so that you know what to do with them in a situation if you need to move the project. So to build great leaders, you need to invest in them to understand who they are. And then they need to feel comfortable enough to express that so that you know exactly what they're good at, and then you nurture that.
That is super helpful. I'm just translating that here in the chat. And that's just, some very good insights. And look, I think I want to thank you again, Anthony, for making the time. I know that you're a busy guy, and this has been very helpful for me, for a lot of the folks in the audience today. Leadership development and building the next generation of leaders in Chile and Latin America is going to be of critical importance, for people to kind of take the economy to the next level. In Chile, there's a lot of conversation around the ability of technology and startups to take the economy to a next level, right? And get it away from the traditional dependency that it's had in the past. So leadership is going to be a critical piece of that, right? And a lot of things that we talked, I think, are going to be very valuable to folks. So thanks once again for the time. Always awesome to catch up with you. As we always say, we need to do this a lot more often. So we'll do that more. And then I want to thank everybody in the audience. Muchas gracias a todos por participar, por su interés, por las preguntas. También gracias al equipo de LIP, José, en marketing y todos los demás por haber creado esta oportunidad para nosotros. Esperamos que fue útil para ustedes. Cualquier cosa nos pueden mandar un mail para saber más de LIP, nuestros productos y servicios. Pueden obviamente visitar a la página de LIP en www.golip.cl, y ahí pueden ver todos los servicios que tenemos en torno al liderazgo, tanto a nivel organizacional como a nivel de equipo y individuos. Así que ojalá se ponen en contacto con nosotros, que nos siguen en nuestras páginas sociales en LinkedIn y otros lugares. Y bueno, estaremos atentos para la próxima sesión. Muchas gracias por su atención y nos despedimos de ustedes. Que tengan buen día. Anthony, thanks again for the generous time. Keep in touch. Great to get your perspectives as always. And, I'm sure we'll continue to talk soon, because I want to share with you the next fascinating chapter of where we're going in LEAP. So have a nice evening or great rest.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me.
Anytime. Thanks again. Hasta luego a todos. Take care. Good night. Farewell. Auf Wiedersehen. Goodbye. Ciao.